The past is not merely a collection of memorized dates and names. It is the culmination of forgotten lives, unfulfilled dreams, and decisions whose echoes resonate to this very day. Throughout our first week, we delved into the margins of history, touching the human stories that lie just beyond the familiar. Now, we bring this voyage of discovery together into one uninterrupted experience. Sit back and lend your ear to the silent witnesses of history, presenting the first week's compilation. How was it that ancient Egyptian astronomers, operating entirely devoid of modern optical instrumentation, managed to inscribe a flawless celestial projection of the heavens from exactly 10.5 millennia ago onto a single sheet of botanical papyrus? You have arrived here seeking an alternative to the mundane narratives and repetitive murmurs so often prescribed for the exhausted mind. You are pursuing instead a far more profound and elevated auditory atmosphere. Welcome to the Intellectual Sleep series by Uncharted History, a sanctuary where your consciousness will find respite not through superficial auditory cues, but through the luxurious, solemn tranquility of history, empirical data, and uncharted architectural minutiae. Our objective here is not to instruct your physical state, but rather to entrust your intellect to the deep, encyclopedic, and time-dilating exposition characteristic of a seasoned academic lecture. Tonight, as your cognitive faculties gracefully decelerate, your awareness will be fully immersed in a genuine, ancient, scholarly enigma. We are embarking upon an exceedingly unhurried, information-dense expedition into the mechanical intellect behind the lost star map that dictated the geometric alignment of the pyramids, delving into the structural texture of desiccated, millennia-old papyri and the chemical alchemy of carbonized inks. Under the substantial weight of these historical particulars and their mathematical flawlessness, your mind will naturally succumb to intellectual fatigue, organically discovering the profound, unshakable stillness it inherently requires. If you are prepared for the unparalleled quietude brought forth by sheer erudition, we now step into the dimly illuminated, frigid corridors where our exposition begins. At this precise moment, you find yourself standing in the crisp atmosphere of an Egyptian night, circa 1500 BCE. Beyond these walls, the merciless diurnal heat that scorches the desert landscape has been supplanted by the sharp, desiccated chill of the nocturnal climate. However, as you advance toward the inner courtyard of the temple complex, the muffled, heavy and rhythmic reverberation of your soft leather sandals against the colossal limestone blocks is accompanied by another, much deeper resonance. This is the profound, unceasing murmur of the Nile River, meandering languidly within its dark, fertile bed, many meters beneath the elevated terrace upon which this monolithic temple was erected. The auditory footprint of this massive body of water, which has followed the exact same trajectory with the identical solemnity for millennia, strikes the exterior walls of the sanctuary and fractures, seeping into the vast courtyard as nothing more than a localized whisper. This acoustic infiltration, slipping between the colossal sandstone masonry, imparts the distinct illusion that time itself has been suspended behind these impenetrable walls. As your steps guide you toward the heart of the sanctuary, into the cavernous pillared corridor known as the hypostyle hall, you find yourself pausing, momentarily immobilized by the overwhelming magnitude and flawless mathematical precision of the surrounding architecture. Hewn from enormous blocks of sandstone, transported via barges from the southern quarries of Nubia, and integrated with hundreds of tons of Aswan granite, these pillars ascend toward the heavens, resembling a petrified forest. The shaft of each column is adorned with millimeter-perfect symmetry, bearing delicate incisions that emulate the closed buds of the papyrus plant indigenous to the Nile Delta. The monumental ceiling blocks supported by these columns, suspended nearly 20 meters above the floor, are cloaked in a meticulous reproduction of the night sky. A deep lapis lazuli expanse, adorned with 5-pointed astronomical stars, painstakingly rendered in pure gold leaf. Navigating through this forest of stone, you can tangibly perceive how these massive monolithic blocks, having absorbed the golden thermal radiation of the sun god Ra throughout the day, now release a deep, ancient, and highly insulated coolness into the night. The heavy, mineral scent of the air, thick with the aroma of millennia-old dust and the passage of epochs, pulls your cognition further into the measured, unhurried rhythm of antiquity with every inhalation. The surface upon which you tread transcends conventional masonry. Each limestone slab is interlocked with such an impeccable degree of surface tension that not even a single blade of papyrus could be inserted between the seams, and this structural integrity was achieved entirely without the utilization of mortar. The architects of this temple, whilst positioning these colossal blocks with microscopic exactitude, carefully calibrated the ratio of subterranean soil and sand beneath the paving stones using a highly specialized acoustic formula. Consequently, the percussive sound of your footsteps, rather than echoing harshly against the cavernous vault, is immediately absorbed into the depths of the floor, settling into a heavy, narcotic cadence. This mathematical flawlessness envelops you not merely as an abstract philosophical concept, but as the structural embodiment of Ma'at, the foundational Egyptian doctrine of universal order, equilibrium, and justice, translated directly into civil engineering. As you deviate into the dimly lit corridor at the terminus of the pillared hall, the olfactory palette of the atmosphere undergoes a sudden, yet remarkably subtle, transformation. The earthy scent of alluvial deposits carried by the Nile is now interlaced with a far more refined, aristocratic aroma. This is the sweet, non-astringent, yet cognitively clarifying resin of the frankincense tree, procured from the distant land of Punt through months of perilous maritime navigation along the African coast. Combined with the slightly bitter, woody undertones of myrrh, this incense smoke hangs suspended in the stagnant air, carving lazy, hypnotic spirals within the feeble, golden illumination cast by the olive oil-fueled copper lamps affixed to the corridor walls. Advancing beneath this subdued light, your fingertips involuntarily trace the deep recesses of the hieroglyphics etched into the stone. You can physically feel how every avian figure, every geometric eye, and every astronomical symbol was excavated with infinite patience, millimeter by millimeter, utilizing copper chisels and heavy diorite mallets thousands of years ago. At the culmination of this corridor, you stand before the massive portal that opens into the most heavily guarded and esoteric epicenter of the entire complex, the Per Ankh, or the House of Life. In stark contrast to the monolithic stone thresholds found elsewhere in the temple, this door was constructed from centuries-old Lebanese cedar, felled upon high mountain slopes, transported via massive vessels down the Nile, and possessing an extraordinary metallurgical-like resistance to both decay and insectile degradation. The dark, resinous veins running through the timber glint faintly under the tremulous lamplight. Upon exerting gentle pressure against the ornately carved bronze handles, the heavy, respectful groan of metal rotating within its wooden housing reverberates through the void. The instant you cross the threshold, the residual echoes of the temple's vast, open spaces, along with the final fragments of the exterior world, dissipate entirely. They are instantaneously replaced by the consuming, heavy, and profoundly solemn silence of a narrow chamber, dense with thousands of papyrus scrolls, towering wooden archives, and concentrated intellect. This space is no mere repository of texts. It is a sacred laboratory where the mechanics of the cosmos, the breath of the pantheon, and the trajectories of the stars are meticulously recorded, duplicated, and preserved. Proceeding quietly across the stone floor of the House of Life, in an era situated millennia before the colossal columns of the Library of Alexandria would ever be raised, you bear witness to the incredibly elite, inaccessible, and mechanical discipline with which data was safeguarded. In this chamber, the act of writing was not a mechanical chore, but the execution of a cosmic mandate. To transcribe a word onto papyrus via hieroglyphic or hieratic script was to grant that entity ontological existence within the very fabric of the universe. Therefore, no margin of error was permitted within these walls. Every astronomical observation was systematically replicated across generations with the exact same rigor and inflexible methodologies. The shelving units that line the perimeter of the room, ascending from the stone floor to the ceiling, are the product of exquisite carpentry, carved from a specific species of acacia wood that masterfully absorbs ambient moisture to safeguard the delicate documents within. The interior of each shelf is densely packed with thousands of meticulously rolled manuscripts, their extremities tagged with precise ivory or bone identifiers. Every single one of these texts has been tightly bound in custom-woven linen and lightly sealed with bitter frankincense oil to deter biological degradation. The ceiling is equipped with a highly sophisticated network of concealed, cross-ventilating shafts designed to facilitate the slow circulation of stagnant air without generating even the slightest auditory disturbance or disruptive draft. These architectural lungs perfectly counterbalance the nocturnal chill of the desert with the humidity of the Nile, maintaining the deep, luxurious thermal consistency of the room with absolute metric precision. The chaos of the external world, the clamor of war chariots, the cacophony of the marketplaces, remains locked behind these impenetrable stone walls, rendering it as inconsequential and distant as a dead star billions of light years away. Within this sanctuary, only an absolute stillness and the heavy, unshakable presence of empirical truth dictate the atmosphere. In the exact center of the chamber rests an expansive cedar table, its surface layered with a microscopic veneer of pure gold leaf, and its massive legs sculpted in the likeness of lion paws. Upon that table, illuminated solely by the slow, rhythmic flickering of a single olive oil lamp, lies the pale, weathered papyrus scroll containing centuries of classified astronomical data, patiently waiting in the darkness for your deliberate approach. As you slowly approach that expansive cedar table situated in the exact center of the chamber, its surface layered with an ultra-thin veneer of pure gold leaf, its massive legs meticulously sculpted into the form of leonine paws, even the heavy resonance of your footsteps against the stone flooring is respectfully absorbed by the consuming silence. Upon the table, patiently awaiting under the golden, slow flickering illumination of a single olive oil-fueled copper lamp, rests an ancient relic. This is the lost astronomical papyrus, carrying the sheer weight of millennia upon its surface, its perimeters gently eroded by the imperceptible friction of time. As your fingertips make physical contact with the cylindrical body of this unparalleled historical document, the exceptionally faint, unhurried rustle of a 1,000-year-old desiccated leaf reverberates through the stagnant air of the chamber. With bated breath, as if terrified of compromising the structural integrity of the artifact, you incrementally overcome the resistance of those brittle fibers, meticulously unrolling the scroll across the flawlessly smooth plane of the wooden table. When your visual focus narrows upon this pale, yellowish expanse situated beneath your fingertips, you register that the object before you is no mere writing substrate, but rather a masterpiece of botanical alchemy and mechanical engineering. The transformation of the delicate cyperus papyrus, a botanical specimen native to the shallow marshes of the Nile Delta, reaching heights of up to 3 meters, into a resilient parchment capable of bearing the secrets of the cosmos within this solemn archive, constitutes a highly mechanized ritual in its own right. The master artisans of ancient Egypt would execute a procedure of profound precision, carefully stripping away the rigid, verdant exterior of the plant to access the spongy, immaculate white pith concealed within. This pith was subsequently sectioned into microscopic, longitudinally uniform strips, utilizing specialized bronze surgical blades. Observing the papyrus upon the table with intense scrutiny, you can still discern the precise geometric grid system established by the artisan on that ancient day. You witness the structural lattice where the horizontal fibers were laid across the vertical substrate with absolute millimeter-perfect alignment, leaving entirely no spatial voids between the interwoven layers. Following a prolonged submersion in the mineral-dense, faintly alluvial waters of the Nile, these interlaced strips were subjected to hours of rhythmic, percussive force via heavy wooden mallets. Every successive impact of the wooden instrument against the fibrous matrix served to extract the plant's inherent cellular sap, a natural biological adhesive, thereby facilitating a molecular fusion between the horizontal and vertical strata without the introduction of any external binding agents. Following the desiccation phase, the surface was subjected to days of intensive friction using burnishing implements carved from ivory or marine shell. Consequently, the material beneath your fingertips now presents a paradoxical tactile sensation, simultaneously offering the organic texture of timber and the frictionless resistance of highly polished stone. That faint frictional drag against your skin serves as a physical manifestation of the immense, mechanized patience exhibited by the hands that engineered this substrate thousands of years ago. Leaning closer to the mesmerizing notations inscribed upon the papyrus, the hieratic script detailing the chronological regression of the celestial sphere, you recognize that the act of writing here was not an ordinary transcription, but a chemical marriage wherein matter coalesced with intellect. The scribes of the House of Life, in their pursuit of ontological permanence, formulated the chemistry of their inks from the most immutable elements found in nature. The profound, matte black nomenclature visible upon the document is not a rudimentary amalgamation of soot and water. This carbon black pigment was synthesized through the meticulous extraction of pure carbon particulates, harvested painstakingly from the soot of olive oil lamps or the underside of culinary ceramics, which were then extensively pulverized and homogenized with desiccated acacia sap, known as gum arabic, beneath the blistering desert sun. The acacia resin acted as the quintessential binding agent, amalgamating the carbon molecules and essentially welding them directly into the cellulose lattice of the papyrus. Because the elemental nature of carbon renders it entirely impervious to fading, oxidation, or chromatic degradation, these characters retain the exact same heavy, solemn obsidian depth as the day they were initially inscribed. However, the specific element upon the cartographic projection that truly captivates your observation is the array of crimson astronomical symbols and celestial markers, gleaming amidst the matte black script like sacred, cautionary beacons. This distinctive chromatic pigment was excavated from the deep subterranean strata of the Egyptian landscape. It is a highly concentrated iron oxide harvested from deposits of red ochre. The pure iron oxide earth was systematically pulverized within heavy diorite mortars for days, ground until absolutely no granular irregularities remained, and subsequently bound with water and acacia resin to manifest this sacred red ink. As the illumination from the copper lamp reflects across the surface of the papyrus, the microscopic iron particulates suspended within the ochre trap the ambient light, imparting a distinct brick red, faintly striated and deeply tactile dimensionality to the geometric lines. Upon microscopic visual inspection, you realize that while the carbon-based black ink has been completely absorbed by the porous surface of the papyrus, the iron-dense red ink rests atop the fibers, generating a microscopic topological elevation that possesses actual physical mass. The implement utilized to embed these inscriptions upon the papyrus was a slender reed stylus fashioned from Juncus maritimus, a fragile rush cultivated in the saline waters of the estuarine marshes. Yet the scribe did not sharpen the extremity of this reed with a blade. Rather, he delicately masticated the tip, utilizing the mechanical action of his own jaw to separate the botanical fibers, thereby transforming it into a microscopically fine, highly sensitive brush. Gazing upon the elegant arcs charted across the map, The ultra-fine trajectories linking the constellations, and the curvature of the numerals calculating the precessional cycle, you can mentally reconstruct precisely how the scribe maneuvered this delicate brush across the structural weave. Within the profound, heavy silence of the archive, you begin to experience an auditory hallucination. The exceptionally faint, woody friction of the reed brush gliding across the intersecting vertical and horizontal fibers of the papyrus. This acoustic footprint represents the physical manifestation of nomenclature permeating the parchment, the materialization of empirical data, and the sealing of the heavens within this dimly lit terrestrial library. And while your consciousness traverses this realm of chemical and physical perfection, the mechanical patience of the ancient world, time outside the house of life continues to advance alongside the slow, imperceptible rotation of the stars. While your consciousness remains captivated by the consuming silence of the chamber and the profound weight of the microscopic chemical craftsmanship upon the papyrus, your auditory focus drifts imperceptibly toward the singular, rhythmic anomaly within the room. In one of the deeply shadowed alcoves of the House of Life, time itself has assumed a physical manifestation, asserting its presence with mechanical persistence. This is the clepsydra, an instrument of flawless calibration through which the Egyptians fractured the dark hours of the night, situated within a recess barely penetrated by the illumination of the copper lamp. It is meticulously sculpted from translucent alabaster, a material visually akin to marble, yet possessing a structural density that refracts and absorbs light from within, radiating a heavy, muted luminescence. Observing the flawless surface of that stone vessel from your current vantage point, you perceive a distinct reverberation echoing through the stagnant air every 4 seconds. This is the profound, muffled, and mesmerizing acoustic signature of a solitary water droplet, escaping through a millimeter-precise aperture at the base of the stone, impacting the bronze receptacle positioned directly beneath it. This resonance represents more than the mere collision of fluid dynamics against metallurgy. It is the auditory manifestation of the universe, the celestial bodies, and the encompassing darkness being mathematically partitioned with absolute geometric exactitude. Yet, this alabaster vessel is no rudimentary container arbitrarily pierced at its nadir. Were it a simple cylinder, the hydrostatic pressure exerted upon the base would proportionally diminish as the internal water level receded. Consequently, the velocity of the descending droplets would decelerate, entirely nullifying the empirical validity of the chronometric measurement. The masterful priest engineers of ancient antiquity circumvented this variable of fluid mechanics by engineering an immaculate geometry. The interior of the clepsydra is not a uniform cylinder, but rather an inverted, truncated cone, tapering inward as it descends. As the total volume of fluid decreases, the progressively narrowing diameter of the vessel perfectly compensates for the loss of pressure, permanently stabilizing the rate of descent. Thus, the velocity of the initial droplet falling from a completely full vessel is mathematically identical to the final droplet released hours later, preserving that 4-second interval with absolute metric rigidity. Furthermore, the internal curvature of this water clock features 12 distinct vertical columns, inscribed at varying depths to account for the fluctuating duration of the nocturnal cycle throughout the changing seasons. When the astronomical nights abbreviate during the summer solstice, a specific column is utilized. When the nights elongate during the winter, an alternate axis dictates the measurement. Each individual column is meticulously demarcated by small, equidistantly spaced cavities that signify the passage of an hour. When the internal fluid level descends to the precise alignment of a specific cavity, a scribe, maintaining the nocturnal vigil, silently transcribes the expiration of another hour onto the papyrus, utilizing his carbon black ink and reed stylus. As the surface tension of the fluid, the principles of fluid dynamics, and the geometric perfection contained within that cornerstone draw your intellect into a heavy, mathematical deceleration, the infallible rhythm of the droplets continues to echo against the monolithic masonry of the temple walls. Every individual droplet descending from the water clock measures not merely the temporal progression within this dimly lit archive, but also synchronizes with the silent ritual of the astronomer priests currently holding vigil directly above you, positioned beneath the exposed desert sky upon the massive, monolithic sandstone roof of the temple. These observers do not require the complexities of glass optics or intricate metallic gear systems to survey the heavens. They wield instruments of profound structural simplicity, containing a pure, unadulterated geometry of their own. Projecting your intellect onto the frigid nocturnal expanse above that colossal roof, you can envision the high priest grasping the measuring implement designated as the merket, or the instrument of knowing. The merket is a longitudinal, flawlessly straight wooden rod, extracted with extreme precision from the central rib of a palm frond, its surface heavily burnished by years of continuous human handling. Suspended vertically from the distal end of this rod is a plumb line, woven from highly tensile linen thread. Attached to the terminus of this string is a diminutive conical weight, typically hewn from dense black granite, utilized to establish an absolute gravitational perpendicularity. Positioned directly opposite the high priest sits a secondary observer, his orientation locked strictly toward the north, focusing upon the star Thuban within the constellation of Draco, the celestial body serving as the pole star during this specific epoch. This second priest manipulates another wooden apparatus known as the bay, likewise carved from the structural tissue of a palm leaf, featuring an exceptionally narrow, V-shaped observation notch at its apex. The two priests assume their reciprocal positions along a flawless north-south meridian line, deeply incised directly into the stone architecture of the temple roof. The observer wielding the bay peers through the narrow V-shaped aperture, optically aligning the taut linen plumb line suspended from the opposing merket with the exact astronomical coordinates of the star Thuban. The moment this optical alignment is achieved, a massive, invisible cosmic boundary is established, an immense celestial meridian effectively bisecting the heavens into eastern and western hemispheres. Following the establishment of this boundary, their sole remaining objective is to maintain an absolute, unshakable stillness. Their visual focus is rigidly fixed upon a specific sequence of 36 stellar groups, designated by the Egyptians as the decans, the celestial bodies responsible for calibrating the hours of the night. Accompanied by the immense, slow axial rotation of the Earth, the targeted decan star drifts progressively from the eastern horizon toward the west, eventually intersecting that invisible vertical meridian. The precise fraction of a second wherein the starlight intersects the ultra-fine linen thread of the merket generates a synchronous cosmic event with the droplet of the water clock echoing in the dimly lit depths of the house of life below. The star intersects the thread, the droplet descends, and empirical time is permanently recorded. This astronomical rotation persists throughout the duration of the night, devoid of any emotional variable, devoid of any deviation, repeating itself with a completely mechanical, frigid, and mathematical finality. Your consciousness, suspended within this heavy monotony forged by infinite measurements, the numerical data descending from the plumb line, and the rhythmic descent of water droplets, sinks ever deeper into the profound, unyielding stillness born of absolute knowledge. As your intellect entirely stabilizes beneath the profound weight of the water clock's immutable mechanical cycle and the mathematical computations executed by the sentinel priests above, your attention slowly, almost gravitationally, pivots back to the ancient parchment resting upon the table. The acoustic reverberation of the droplets in the dim recesses of the house of life now recedes to the periphery of your consciousness, morphing into a dissipating, increasingly sparse cadence. Simultaneously, a remarkably subtle, resonance-free draft of nocturnal desert air filters through the elevated ventilation apertures of the sanctuary. This gentle atmospheric current spirals deliberately around the hundreds of tons of frigid limestone columns, integrating with the stagnant air of the archive, and causes the extremity of the papyrus to undulate with a microscopic vibration, as if hesitant to disturb the integrity of those millennial fibers. Focusing the illumination of the copper lamp toward the epicenter of that trembling parchment, you begin to trace the trajectory of a massive figure rendered in the sacred red ink derived from iron oxide, a constellation schematic superimposed upon a geometric grid. This cartographic projection is no mundane replication of the contemporary sky. It is a flawless astronomical projection of what the ancient Egyptians designated as Sahu, the sovereign of the southern celestial hemisphere, and the astral manifestation of Osiris, known today as the constellation Orion, alongside Sopdet, the star Sirius, which ascended immediately in its wake to herald the annual inundation of the Nile. The red iron oxide particulates deposited upon the papyrus have been applied with varying volumetric brushstrokes corresponding to the visual magnitude of the individual stars, imparting an almost three-dimensional topographical depth to the triad of luminaries constituting Orion's belt. However, as you subject the mathematical vectors and celestial meridian lines upon the parchment to the rigorous optical scrutiny of an investigator, you detect a profound structural inconsistency, a magnificent discrepancy that triggers a deep intellectual curiosity without elevating your physiological state, inducing only a state of pure, scholarly awe. The angular declination of the stars plotted on this map relative to the horizon strictly fails to correspond with the celestial sphere of the 1500s BCE suspended above you, nor does it align with the contemporary coordinates currently being extracted by the astronomers utilizing the Merket on the roof. This is neither an observational error nor a scribe's mechanical negligence. The document laid before you projects, with extraordinary empirical precision, the slow, massive, and silent axial wobble of the Earth itself, the cosmic cycle defined within modern astrophysics as the precession of the equinoxes. Our planetary sphere does not rotate through the vacuum of space as a perfectly vertical globe. Its axis is oriented with an approximate inclination of 23.5 degrees relative to the orbital plane, and much like a decelerating, massive gyroscopic top, its polar extremities trace a vast, imperceptibly slow circular trajectory over millennia. This gyroscopic wobble operates at such a profoundly protracted velocity that the relative coordinates of the stars appear entirely static throughout the duration of a human lifespan. The stellar bodies undergo a microscopic displacement of merely 1 degree along the celestial meridian every 72 terrestrial years. Yet, the culmination of this precessional rotation, the interval required for the axis to complete one full revolution and return to its point of origin, encompasses an immense epoch of approximately 25,920 years, an era recognized as a Platonic year. Leaning over the table in the subdued illumination of the House of Life, the sheer intellectual density of realizing how the Egyptian scribes observed, catalogued, and mathematically regressed this 1 degree deviation across successive generations, dynasties, and ages descends upon your cognition with an unyielding gravity.
This parchment does not represent a contemporary cartography of the stars. It is a retroactively engineered simulation of the celestial sphere situated tens of thousands of years in the past, an epoch the Egyptians classified as Zep Tepi, the primeval first time. The algorithmic calculations inscribed upon the papyrus point with millimeter-perfect exactitude to the era of roughly 10,500 BCE, the precise chronological moment when the constellation Orion reached the absolute nadir of its precessional cycle, its most southerly declination along the celestial meridian. And perhaps far more staggering is the realization that the arrangement of the 3 red nodes upon this substrate, the geometric positioning of the stars Alnitak, Alnilam, and Mintaka within the belt of Sahu, functions as the original architectural blueprint for a colossal terrestrial complex. The exact spatial distribution of the 3 great pyramids upon the Giza Plateau, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. These pyramidal structures are not random accumulations of masonry haphazardly deposited upon the desert sands. Just as the third star in the Orion belt, Mintaka, deviates slightly toward the east relative to the primary axis of its two companions, the smallest pyramid, Menkaure, exhibits an intentional, identical angular deflection from the flawless diagonal line established by the two larger monuments. Furthermore, the volumetric mass and the respective albedo of these three structures correlate directly with the absolute visual magnitude of those three celestial bodies. The narrow ventilation shaft ascending at a mathematically flawless angle from the king's chamber in the heart of the Great Pyramid of Khufu, piercing through millions of tons of limestone blocks toward the southern sky, is no incidental architectural void. That specific shaft was immutably locked to the exact transit altitude of Sahu, the belt of Orion, as it crossed the meridian in the year 10,500 BCE, functioning as a petrified telescope permanently fixed upon the infinite. As the consciousness of these cosmic truths and the complex mathematics underpinning millions of tons of stone trickles into your intellect from the red pigments upon that fragile papyrus, standard nomenclature and numerical values begin to surrender their localized meaning. The slow gyroscopic wobble of the Earth, the 26,000-year cycle of the stars, and the calculations spanning tens of millennia, the specific artifacts, the identities of the scribes, and the localized chronologies dissolve and dissipate into this profound ocean of deep space and deep time. The silence enclosed within this chamber is no longer merely the acoustic void of an empty archive. It translates into the resonant frequency of rotating planetary bodies, silently combusting ancient stars and the geometry of eternity. You perceive yourself not merely anchored to the stone floor of this frigid library, but suspended within the center of a vast, dark, and solemnly heavy cosmic sea. Every element remains rigidly in its designated coordinate, every principle functions with mathematical finality, and the entirety of the mechanism continues to rotate in a state of flawless, immutable order, exactly as it has for millennia. As your intellect achieves a state of profound equilibrium beneath the staggering cognitive mass of a tens of thousands of years-long processional cycle and the cosmic alignment of megalithic monuments, you register that the solemn, methodical operations within the house of life are gradually approaching their culmination. Elevated above, upon the monolithic ceiling of the sanctuary, the flawless, silent astronomical surveys conducted by the sentinel priests utilizing their Merket and Bay instruments are methodically drawing to a close. The black granite mass suspended at the terminus of the plumb line exhibits one final, microscopic vibration before achieving absolute vertical stasis. The ultimate celestial body of the 36 nocturnal decans intersects the invisible cosmic meridian, silently transferring its temporal jurisdiction toward the western horizon. Concurrent with the completion of this astronomical rotation, the epochal parchment resting upon the expansive cedar table before you must now be returned to its centurial preservation. Drifting from the surrounding shadows, a temple scribe approaches the table with footsteps so acoustically nullified he appears devoid of physical mass. His digits interact with the delicate cyperus papyrus fibers, the very substrate upon which you just deciphered the cartography of the universe, with an almost inconceivable degree of tactile sensitivity. The process of recoiling the document is no mundane clerical task. It constitutes a highly mechanical and deeply philosophical ritual, symbolizing the hermetic sealing of empirical data against the erosive forces of entropy. Utilizing an ultra-fine cylindrical rod carved from pure ivory, the scribe anchors the leading edge of the papyrus and, with extreme deceleration, begins to rotate the scroll upon itself, closely monitoring the faint, brittle friction emitted by the desiccated botanical fibers with every successive revolution. Once the cylinder is completely contracted, the circumference is strictly bound with a narrow, tightly woven linen ligature. Finally, This sacred astronomical treatise is deposited into a cylindrical housing hewn from acacia wood, its interior hermetically coated with a micron-thin layer of refined beeswax and resin to perpetually repel ambient humidity and biological degradation. The profound, resonant impact of the wooden lid snapping into its final position serves as the philosophical seal, a declaration that the data has once again been insulated from the chaos of the external world, locked away within the unyielding confines of the absolute archive. However, the preservation of this chamber, its accumulated data, and its flawless geometric order is not maintained solely by massive stone masonry and cedar thresholds. The deep, mythological, and intellectual aegis of ancient Egypt is draped across the entirety of the temple complex as the nocturnal darkness fully descends. The celestial deity Nut is conceptualized as having stretched her colossal lapis lazuli form across the terrestrial sphere, acting as an infinite astronomical canopy that effectively exiles the forces of cosmological chaos to the exterior void. Within the dim, stagnant corridors of the House of Life, the solemn, protective presence of the enigmatic entity Tutu, a being rendered with the anatomy of a lion and the intellect of a human, is almost tangibly perceived. Tutu stands as the unshakable warden of rationality and the nocturnal hours, intercepting chaotic cognitive anomalies and psychological disturbances before they can permeate the dark corridors of the mind. Within the boundaries of these stone walls, beneath the luxurious and perpetual weight of pure data, there exists absolutely no spatial tolerance for irregularity, peril, or ambiguity. Every bound scroll, every carved hieroglyph, and every calculated trajectory of the stars is maintained within a state of absolute, immutable stasis, held firmly within the unyielding parameters of universal Ma'at. This is the precise juncture at which the narrator, the voice of historical exposition, gradually retracts, as the vocabulary and the meticulous details fulfill their intended function, stepping aside to accommodate that heavy, deeply satisfying cessation of cognitive processing. As the volume of olive oil within the copper receptacle upon the table systematically diminishes, the braided linen cord functioning as the wick undergoes a higher rate of carbonization, dispersing an exceptionally faint, sweet aroma of combusted carbon into the stagnant atmosphere. The illumination, which previously saturated the localized space with a golden brilliance, now degenerates into a deep, trembling amber hue that rapidly succumbs to the encroaching darkness. Within the distant alcove, as the droplets descending from the alabaster clepsydra reach the lowest chronological cavity, measuring the final fraction of the night, the temporal intervals between each impact stretch outward, adopting an almost infinite sparsity. The shadows cast by the leonine feet of the gilded table elongate progressively, expanding outward to merge with the absolute darkness residing within the monumental wooden shelving, completely dissolving all spatial boundaries. The exceptionally soft resonance of the desert current filtering through the open architectural apertures, combined with the muffled, eternal fluid dynamics of the Nile River flowing through the darkness meters below, gradually transitions into the sole remaining auditory reality. While the hydrocarbon combustion within the copper lamp inevitably ceases, the ancient celestial bodies suspended within the vacuum continue their silent, gyroscopic rotation, performing the exact mechanical function they have executed for millennia. The empirical data housed within the House of Life remains immutably preserved. As the scholarly sentinels of antiquity assume their perpetual vigil, the cognitive faculties may finally surrender to the absolute stillness. The exposition is concluded. Good night. Why is the most profound melancholy of an empire and the most magnificent enigma in the history of world literature concealed within a single page upon which not a solitary drop of ink has ever fallen? In this precise moment, you have discovered the flawless sanctuary you sought to evade the consuming clamor of the modern era, its artificially accelerated time and the ceaseless chaos that exhausts the intellect. You have stepped across this threshold, parting the veil of countless ordinary narratives, for your mind does not seek the triviality of a simple fable, but rather the luxurious gravity of empirical knowledge, profound academic stillness, and historical depth. Tonight, we embark upon an exceptionally deliberate, detailed, and scholarly retreat into the rain-washed, cedar-scented palaces of 11th century Kyoto. As we examine the colossal philosophical void of the renowned Kumogakure chapter within the tale of Genji, universally acknowledged as the world's first novel, you shall bear witness to the molecular chemistry of ink distilled from the soot of ancient pines, the microscopic topography of flawless paper forged from pounded mulberry fibers, and the universal, monolithic order of Japanese architectural paradigms. Leave the exhausting epoch of the outside world firmly behind that heavy door. Your mind is now commencing the architecture of its own profound stillness, guided by the hypnotic, immutable rhythm of historical verities, carved wooden tables, and a millennial aesthetic discipline. As the moon slowly conceals itself behind heavy slate-grey clouds in the nocturnal skies of 11th century Kyoto, you find yourself situated at the absolute epicenter of that isolated universe where the world's first novel was forged. You have long since traversed the labyrinthine, seemingly endless corridors of the Seryoden, the imperial summer palace. Within this dimly illuminated scriptorium, guided only by the trembling luminescence of a solitary candle and a feeble oil lamp, the temporal flow has utterly surrendered to the unyielding, rhythmic cadence of the external rain. The pallid lunar glow, filtering through the translucent shoji paper screens that encircle you, casts elongated, spectral shadows across the flawlessly sanded cedar floorboards. The atmospheric density within this chamber possesses a solemn historical identity, far removed from an ordinary evening. It is a profound synthesis of the resinous crispness of freshly felled hinoki cypress, the arid, slightly astringent scent of ink distilled from centuries-old pine soot, and the dark, humid petrichor ascending from the spring rain striking the earth. The sandalwood incense, emanating from a bronze censer in the corner and hanging suspended in the still air, further deepens the aristocratic, scholarly isolation of your present domain. As your fingertips glide imperceptibly across the frigid, immaculate surface of the low, black lacquer desk before you, the substantial, physical weight of the 12-layered silk kimono draped across your shoulders anchors you to the exact coordinates of the present moment, grounding your consciousness within an absolute stasis. Before you lies one of the most exquisite aesthetic mysteries in the annals of human history. The original parchment scrolls of Murasaki Shikibu's monumental opus, The Tale of Genji. With the aristocratic rustle of its silk brocade binding, as you unravel the scroll centimeter by deliberate centimeter, your eyes trace the elegant, seemingly choreographed strokes of calligraphy cascading one after another. You follow this undulating river of ink until you arrive at that specific, legendary juncture, Kumogakure, the chapter universally translated as vanishing behind the clouds. The page is unequivocally, monolithically blank. For a millennium, literary historians, aesthetic theorists, and antiquarian archivists have endlessly debated the anatomy and the causality of this absolute void. Why, at the very structural core of this mythic text, exists a page upon which not a single syllable was inscribed, where the carbon-based ink was purposefully denied any cellular interaction with the paper? Serving as the most flawless manifestation of the Japanese artistic philosophy of Ma, the concept of meaningful structural emptiness, this parchment is not, in fact, an unwritten narrative. Rather, it is a meditative architecture that demands a colossal, uninterrupted silence in order to be perceived, comprehended, and fully inhabited by the intellect. When you direct your gaze with meticulous scrutiny toward the mulberry fibers, painstakingly pounded and smoothed in the freezing currents of mountain rivers, a microscopic topographical variation reveals itself, but only in those rare, fleeting instances when the lamplight strikes at a precise, oblique angle. In that exact illumination, the vestigial traces of a concealed temple path, etched into the cellular porosity of the paper with an infinitesimally fine, invisible ink, begin to emerge from the void. Tonight, stripping away the exhaustive velocity, the mechanical dissonance, and the chaotic fragmentation of the external world, our collective cognition shall take refuge within the flawless silence constructed by this thousand-year-old emptiness. We shall not merely investigate the absence of a text. We shall meticulously examine the optical refraction coefficient of the paper's microscopic texture, the exact chemical composition of ink enduring from centuries past, and the mathematical symmetry that governs the slumber of an ancient imperial court. As the solemn, deliberate, and immaculate weight of pure information descends upon your shoulders like a heavy mantle, your intellect will secure an immovable, profound locus within this, the most elegant void in recorded history. The mechanical dissonance and the exhausting velocity of the external world, which you have systematically left behind, are instantaneously consumed the moment you cross the threshold of this ancient structure. Absorbed by the labyrinth of multi-tiered Japanese cedar canopies and heavy earthen walls. The expansive roof extending directly above your head, transmuting the heavy acoustic impact of the raindrops into an internal metronome, is no rudimentary feat of carpentry. It is an immense organic shield known as hiwadabuki. This architectural marvel is constructed by meticulously stripping the bark of centuries-old cypress trees to a millimeter's thickness, compressing thousands of overlapping layers and interlocking them entirely with bamboo pegs, deliberately omitting a single metallic nail. This canopy does not merely exclude the precipitation. It operates as an atmospheric filter, allowing the nocturnal chill, the dense humidity, and the very flow of time to gradually permeate the dim scriptorium. As your physical weight integrates with the yielding yet substantial woven matrix of the tatami mat, engineered from densely compressed rice straw, you perceive that this surrounding timber architecture is functionally respiring, expanding infinitesimally with each droplet of moisture and subtly flexing against every fluctuation of the wind. However, the reassuring enclosure of this chamber is an architectural illusion, for this silent pavilion is immovably anchored at the exact epicenter of one of the most rigid, mathematically flawless urban planning paradigms the world has ever witnessed, stretching out beneath the darkness and the rain. Heian-kyo. When you project your cognition beyond the confines of this room, extending it into the rain-washed nocturnal arteries of Kyoto, you encounter an immense grid layout, the Jobo system, modeled at the terminus of the 8th century upon the Tang dynasty capital of Chang'an. The metropolis is systematically partitioned into colossal urban blocks by broad avenues intersecting at absolute right angles, advancing relentlessly from north to south and east to west, mirroring a monumental chessboard. The width, linear trajectory, and convergence points of these thoroughfares are entirely devoid of randomness. They are predicated upon a severe geometry symbolizing the unyielding gravitational weight of imperial authority. Bisecting this massive network is the Suzaku Odori, the great vermilion bird boulevard, dissecting the capital into two perfectly symmetrical hemispheres, while at the absolute nexus of this monolithic order, precisely the coordinate you currently occupy, rests the great imperial palace complex. For the architects of the epoch, this geometric infallibility was not merely a matter of pragmatic urban administration. It was the physical inscription of Onmyodo, the esoteric doctrine of yin-yang and the 5 elements, into stone, earth, and timber, designed to exert absolute dominion over cosmic respiration, chaotic natural phenomena, and imperceptible spiritual currents. Heian-kyo was engineered as the terrestrial projection of an astronomical map, The topography encircling the capital was meticulously aligned to be garrisoned by the 4 celestial guardians. The Kamo River, flowing with unblemished currents to the east, manifested the azure dragon, Seiryu. The primary arterial roads to the west represented the white tiger, Byakko. The expansive Ogura basin to the south embodied the vermilion bird, Suzaku, and the imposing precipitous mountain ranges to the north signified the black tortoise, Gembu. While this monumental geomantic installation ensured the orderly, river-like circulation of universal energy, Qi, through the municipal grid, the trajectory of malevolent forces anticipated from the northeast, the Kimon, or Demon Gate, was structurally obstructed by the colossal physical mass of Mount Hiei. As you remain seated upon the floor of this summer pavilion, you are not merely occupying a building. You are situated at the epicenter of a massive mathematical equation, a heavy, static, and absolute cosmic bulwark that systematically repels the chaos of the universe. As you gradually retract your focal point from that expansive cosmic grid back into the immediate confines of the Seiryo-den Pavilion, the profound, limitless spatial continuum inherent to the Shinden-zukuri architectural style becomes distinctly apparent. These structures fundamentally reject the suffocating, dense masonry characteristic of Western fortresses. Instead, beneath the immense canopies sustained by flawless, unadorned timber columns, interior volumes are demarcated solely by sliding paper screens, diaphanous silk draperies, and misu blinds woven from the finest bamboo laminates. This architecture was not conceived to subjugate the natural environment, but rather to permit the wind, the photons, and the seasonal transitions to flow through the edifice without structural impediment. The primary floor is elevated upon heavy pilings, hovering approximately half a meter above the earth, deliberately engineered to evade the dense terrestrial spring humidity and subterranean biological activity. From the drainage channels situated immediately beneath the floorboards, where the accumulated precipitation methodically percolates into the soil, a microscopic, almost imperceptible hydraulic whisper ascends through the timber skeleton of the room. In these advancing hours of the night, as the silence acquires a profound physical density, the hyper-calculated arrangement of this space and the static epistemology of its architecture gradually recalibrate the irregular, chaotic cognitive flow within your own mind, synchronizing it to its own deliberate cadence. That colossal chessboard extending beyond the walls, the flawlessly aligned rivers, the celestial guardians, and this surrounding imperial chrysalis woven from silk and timber construct a dense, information-saturated, and impregnable perimeter around your existence. As your gaze fixates upon the fibrous matrix of that blank parchment roll in the dim illumination, the sole kinetic activity within this chamber, bearing the accumulated weight of centuries, remains the rhythmic, eternal lullaby of the raindrops descending just beyond the shoji screens. As the flawless geometry of that colossal urban blueprint gradually dissolves within your mind beneath the monotonous rhythm of the rain, you focus your vision and cognitive perception upon the low writing desk positioned immediately before you, a surface gleaming like an obsidian mirror in the dim illumination. This desk is no mere fragment of wood. It is a supreme manifestation of the traditional Japanese lacquerware art known as urushi, transmuting the 11th century Heian era's extraordinary conception of patience and temporal flow into a tangible, physical form. The feeble luminescence of the oil lamp filtering into the chamber does not scatter upon striking the desk's surface. Rather, it is seemingly absorbed by the profound, abyssal layers of the lacquer. As your fingertips traverse this frigid, immaculate plane, you are, in fact, touching the culmination of a chemical and physical ordeal that spanned several arduous months. This raw lacquer, meticulously extracted from the toxic sap of the Toxicodendron vernicifluum tree, was purified with paramount precision by master artisans, then applied to the wooden armature in microscopic increments, perhaps 30, perhaps 40 consecutive layers, using a specialized brush. The most compelling academic paradox of this metallurgical process dictates that urushi lacquer does not require a hot, arid environment to cure.
Conversely, to initiate the necessary polymerization, it demands an atmospheric humidity exceeding 70% within entirely darkened, damp incubation chambers known as furo. Each diaphanous layer was sequestered within these lightless rooms for consecutive days, only to be subsequently abraded at a microscopic level, utilizing the finest deer antler powder and high-grade charcoal dust. This desk, therefore, is not merely a utilitarian object upon which a parchment rests. It is the crystallized, solidified embodiment of atmospheric moisture, meticulous human endurance, and the very passage of time. Directly upon this solemn obsidian surface, the historical instruments destined to forge the world's first and most magnificent psychological novel are arranged with an absolute, uncompromising symmetry. Positioned within the reach of your right hand rests a heavy inkstone, designated as a suzuri. Sculpted from dense slate extracted from the freezing glacial riverbeds north of Kyoto, stone compressed by millions of years of immense tectonic pressure, this instrument is divided into a deep reservoir designed to hold water, umi, and an inclined abrasive plane upon which the ink is ground, ochre. The substance that is submerged in the water and subjected to the microscopic friction of the stone's surface is not a rudimentary pigment. It is a highly complex organic compound in the form of a solid sumi ink block. The pure carbon soot, harvested by slowly incinerating the trunks and branches of centuries-old red pines within oxygen-deprived kilns, was meticulously kneaded, almost mechanically, with nikawa, a natural proteinaceous binder distilled by boiling animal hides and fish bones over an extended duration, before being compressed into wooden molds and left to cure for months. As your hand, extending from beneath the immense weight of the silk kimono, grasps the ink block and begins to grind it against the stone in circular, unvarying motions, the resinous, smoky aroma of pine that permeates the chamber, combined with the resonant, hypnotic friction echoing from the slate, generates a meditative frequency that effectively seals off the external world, calibrating the mind strictly for the architecture of prose. A millennium ago, at this very desk, sat one of the greatest intellectual luminaries in the history of literature. A woman belonging to the aristocratic Fujiwara clan, Murasaki Shikibu. Within the claustrophobic, profoundly isolated hierarchy of the Heian imperial court, high-ranking ladies-in-waiting, known as nyobo, spent the overwhelming majority of their existence completely sequestered from the masculine gaze, perpetually concealed behind heavy bamboo blinds, misu, and elaborate silk screens, kicho. Their physical mobility was extraordinarily restricted, encumbered by the sheer mass of the juni hitoi, the 12-layered, 20-kilogram silk kimonos they wore, arranged according to the most uncompromising chromatic rules of seasonal transition, kasane no irome. Yet this absolute physical immobility and societal isolation engendered within their minds an immense, sweeping capacity for observation and analytical psychological depth. While the male bureaucrats of the court drafted official edicts utilizing kanbun, a rigid, angular, unemotional, and entirely masculine script of imported Chinese characters, the women of the court cultivated an unprecedented, revolutionary phonetic alphabet to articulate their internal landscapes and the subtle nuances of romance, melancholy, and political intrigue. Kana, or as it was referred to in that epoch, onnade, the woman's hand. The slender bamboo-shafted brush, fude, held in Murasaki Shikibu's hand, was not merely a tool for transcription. It functioned as a surgical scalpel, carving the aesthetic memory of an entire empire into parchment. The tip of the brush was constructed by binding the finest, most resilient dorsal hairs of winter-hunted hares and wild weasels with pure silk thread. These fibers possessed a flawless capillary dynamic, capable of retaining the ink and transferring it onto the paper, governed solely by the microscopic variations in pressure exerted by the author's wrist. The kana script employed by these women, in stark contrast to the independent, severed strokes of Chinese characters, possessed a continuous, fluid rhythm.
akin to tall grass bending beneath the wind or the undulating currents of a riverbed. The brush connected characters without ever lifting from the surface of the paper. When the brush is drawn across the inkstone, absorbing that dense, ebony liquid into its core, the flow of time within this chamber slows to a near halt. Envision the precise millisecond the tip of the brush makes contact with the imperceptibly rough texture of the washi paper, forged from the pounded fibers of the mulberry tree. This contact is less an intersection of ink and paper than a profound biological convergence. The liquid formulation of pine soot and animal gelatin permeates the microscopic voids between the paper's cellulose fibers at a velocity measured in milliseconds, initiating the curing process that establishes a carbon vein destined to remain indelible for millennia. As Shikibu rendered her syllables onto the parchment with unparalleled kinetic control over her wrist, the thickness or frailty of each brushstroke, the opacity of the ink, and, most crucially, the physical voids she deliberately left between the words, dictated the overarching emotional resonance of the text. The faint, rustling friction of the brush gliding across the paper operates as the solitary acoustic presence within the silence, synchronizing with the rhythm of the rain, functioning like the cogs of a temporal machine meticulously weaving history. And as you sit before this desk, anchoring your focus upon the reverberations of that sound, your mind surrenders entirely to the slow, continuous, and immaculate flow of the brush, immersed within this realm of profound, scholarly gravity and physical stasis. As your fingertips deliberately advance across the ancient, silk-backed parchment pages, each leaf representing the culmination of months of uninterrupted craftsmanship and immense physical endurance, the faint wooden groan of the paper screens vibrating against the external breeze anchors your cognition entirely upon the legendary artifact resting upon the desk. Having traversed the 40th chapter of the tale of Genji, the earliest and most voluminous psychological novel in recorded human history, entitled Mabaroshi, or Illusion, the scroll unspools to deliver you to the 41st chapter, the most magnificent, solemn, and profound philosophical abyss in world literature. Kumogakure, universally translated as vanishing behind the clouds. And upon arriving at this precise juncture, beneath the dim, flickering luminescence of the oil lamp, your eyes are met solely by a colossal, untouched, and absolute physical void. This page is a barren universe, one that has never sustained a single stroke of the brush, nor ever been acquainted with the carbonized chemistry of ink. This absolute emptiness is not the consequence of an author's linguistic exhaustion, nor does it represent an abrupt cessation of the narrative. Conversely, it is an astonishingly deliberate, elevated architectural decision wherein literature and language inherently concede their own limitations. This specific chapter, chronicling the cessation of the terrestrial existence of the narrative's central figure, the resplendent Prince Genji, constitutes a structural rupture so monumental that it simply cannot be articulated through the mundane constraints of vocabulary, the opacity of ink, or the finite capacity of human expression. The concept of Ma within Japanese aesthetics and Zen philosophy, the doctrine of the meaningful void, does not permit the audience to passively consume a narrative. Instead, it imposes upon the observer the arduous task of constructing the colossal gravity of silence within their own consciousness. Simultaneously, this unblemished page serves as the purest, most radical physical manifestation of Mujo, the profound Buddhist philosophy underlying the opulent chromatics and intrigue-laden existence of the Heian court. The immutable truth that all phenomena are transient, inevitably drifting toward absolute dissolution. Rather than trivializing mortality through descriptive prose, Shikibu withdrew her protagonist behind the celestial clouds into a silent, wordless dimension, abandoning the reader to confront the infinity expanding within their own intellect. As you gradually retract your mind from the philosophical gravity of the narrative, recalibrating your optical and cognitive focus entirely upon the microscopic anatomy of that empty page, you will recognize just how complex a biological universe this ostensibly blank expanse truly is. This parchment is no ordinary surface. It is an organic matrix forged during the depths of winter, derived from Kozo mulberry fibers relentlessly pulverized by women in the freezing riverbeds north of Kyoto, amalgamated with a botanical mucilage known as neri, and methodically agitated countless times across fine bamboo sieves. When you examine the paper from an exceptionally close proximity, utilizing the acute horizontal angle of the trembling yellow lamplight, you can observe how the cellulose fibers, measuring a mere thousandth of a millimeter in thickness, interlock and overlap, undulating like a frozen prehistoric riverbed, while microscopic particles of millennial dust rest undisturbed within these cellular valleys. The pale ivory pallor of the paper's surface serves as the empirical evidence of a glacial, centuries-long process of oxidation. This page exists as a living organism that has inhaled and sequestered air, atmospheric moisture, and the relentless passage of time for 1,000 years. Modern literary historians and highly equipped antiquarian archivists found themselves unable to reconcile with this monolithic silence, effectively waging a microscopic war over the decades to definitively ascertain whether this page was, in empirical fact, empty. Had Shikibu perhaps employed an invisible, fugitive compound? Had the calligraphy simply evaporated through the centuries? To decipher this monumental enigma, the parchment was subjected to infrared spectrometers, scanned via advanced multispectral imaging techniques, and rigorously analyzed across varying wavelengths of light and radiation. Every isolated square millimeter of the page was digitally deconstructed in the desperate pursuit of a singular residual carbon molecule originating from pine soot, or the cellular remnants of Nikawa deer horn gelatin. Ultimately, however, empirical science was forced to kneel before profound philosophy. Even beneath the sterile, unyielding illumination of microscopes and lasers, not the slightest atomic trace of ink, nor the faintest cellular compression indicative of a brushstroke could be detected upon the manuscript. The Kumogakure scroll retains the pure, absolute, and almost intimidating untouchability of its inception, preserving its aristocratic void with unyielding dignity. Within this dimly illuminated, hermetically sealed chamber, as your gaze decelerates upon that barren parchment, your consciousness gradually sinks into the depths of those microscopic fibers, the unwritten lexicon, and the colossal, structural void of Ma. Within that physical nothingness, there remains absolutely nothing to decipher. There is merely the acoustic resonance of the wind gliding over the wooden roof, the dense botanical aroma of damp earth infiltrating from the external garden, and the solemn, wordless, infinite stillness bequeathed to you by history's greatest novelist, spanning across a millennium. As the emptiness of the page systematically absorbs and eradicates every residual word within your mind, all that remains is the slow, deliberate, and heavy mechanics of pure comprehension. Following your prolonged immersion within the monumental philosophical void residing upon the desk, the physical mass of a millennial stasis gradually envelops your immediate perimeter, mirroring the methodical descent of the nocturnal darkness. The seemingly infinite, relentless hydraulic cadence of the Haiyan rain finally decelerates and ultimately ceases. As the terminal droplets of moisture percolate through the meticulously raked, pale gravel of the external Kalesansui, the dry landscape garden, and infiltrate the microscopic cellular porosity of the ancient, moss-draped stones, the entire acoustic architecture of the chamber undergoes a fundamental transmutation. The mechanical dissonance of the diurnal hours and the dominant, overarching acoustic veil of the precipitation have been completely eradicated. In their absence, the true sovereigns of the nocturnal epoch, the Suzumushi and Matsumushi, the bell and pine crickets, initiate their colossal, oscillating, and flawlessly synchronized choruses from within the impenetrable darkness. This auditory phenomenon is by no means a strident or chaotic biological clamor. Conversely, it manifests as a heavy, hypnotic pulsation, profoundly reminiscent of the distant, reverberating frequencies of cast iron temple bells. It is a resonant, subterranean frequency that meticulously recalibrates the internal rhythm of human cognition, synchronizing the observer's intellect with the ancient, unyielding biological metronome of the natural world. The silence within the scriptorium is no longer a vacant acoustic vacuum. It is metamorphosed into a dense, tangible mass, saturated by this low-frequency hum and the heavily concentrated botanical olfactory signatures rising from the damp, breathing earth. Operating with a deliberate, almost glacial precision, as though executing the final, irreversible phase of a centuries-old liturgical rite, your hands begin to manipulate the colossal philosophical emptiness of the Kumogakure manuscript, methodically folding the void back upon itself. The arid, papyraceous rustle of the pounded mulberry cellulose converges seamlessly with the muted, aristocratic friction of the silk brocade backing, and the scroll is decisively sealed, preparing to resume its millennial suspension. The binding apparatus you deploy to isolate the parchment from the corrosive elements of the external atmosphere, the kumihimo cord, is no rudimentary textile. It is an artifact of advanced structural engineering. Constructed upon specialized wooden looms, these microscopic silk filaments have been mathematically interlocked over a duration of several months, generating a complex, non-elastic, and biologically impervious locking mechanism that resists the entropic decay of time. Subsequently, the receptacle into which you deposit the secured scroll transcends the parameters of an aesthetic storage vessel. It is a kiribako, a masterpiece of empirical organic engineering meticulously sculpted from the timber of the Paulownia tree, historically designated as the imperial wood. The cellular matrix of the Paulownia exhibits an extraordinary, autonomous hygroscopic functionality. In environments of elevated humidity, the microscopic cellular structures systematically expand, forging an absolute hermetic seal at the structural joints and entirely terminating atmospheric exchange. Conversely, upon a reduction in ambient moisture, the cellular walls contract, facilitating the deliberate expulsion of the trapped, stagnant air. As you lower the carved wooden lid, producing a resonant, conclusive acoustic impact, you are not merely archiving a manuscript, you are interring the parchment within an independent, self-regulating microclimate, an isolated thermodynamic chamber specifically engineered to neutralize the oxidizing degradation of the atmosphere, the insidious proliferation of microscopic fungi, and the relentless, erosive friction of the external temporal flow. The conclusive acoustic reverberation of that wooden lid sealing shut functions simultaneously as the historical echo of the Heian era's gradual, irreversible decrescendo, the extinguishing of an epoch defined by unparalleled aesthetic refinement and profound pacifism. One of the most fundamental epistemological pillars of Japanese aesthetics, the paradigm of mono no aware, the profound, melancholic recognition of the inherent transience of all phenomena, has irrevocably permeated every atom of this chamber, ascending even into the colossal cypress pillars supporting the overarching canopy. For the aristocrats of this specific historical continuum, universal beauty was never anchored in immutable, monolithic stone monuments designed to defy eternity. Rather, aesthetic supremacy was localized precisely within the fleeting existence of cherry blossoms destined to scatter upon the next thermal current, the methodical, chemical fading of ancient ink, or the terminal, dissipating note of a bamboo flute dissolving into the nocturnal void. The deliberate structural omission of the tale of Genji's final chapter, culminating in the perpetual sealing of this very parchment, constitutes a silent, majestic concession that an entire empire, alongside its highly calibrated societal architecture, is inevitably drifting toward its own structural dissolution. As your fingertips trace the flawlessly sanded surface of that wooden archive for the final time, you are bearing witness not merely to a literary artifact, but to the graceful, non-dramatic, entropic decay of absolute magnificence, the methodical return of an architectural and aesthetic zenith to its original, elemental state. The sole source of artificial illumination within your immediate perimeter, the low, wooden armature of the oil lamp, is now experiencing the terminal phases of its thermodynamic lifespan. The igoma, or wild perilla oil, pooled within the shallow clay reservoir, the very hydrocarbon compound that has sustained the visual parameters of this chamber for consecutive hours, is on the precipice of exhausting its final molecular reserves of combustible energy. The capillary action within the slender, fibrous wick falters. The material systematically carbonizes, devolving into a frail, blackened cylinder of soot. Concurrently, the oscillating, brilliant yellow spectrum of the flame undergoes a fundamental chemical transition, mutating into a heavy, dense orange, and ultimately descending into a profound, smoldering crimson. As the thermal output and radiant energy of the combustion deteriorate, your silhouette, previously cast against the translucent paper screens, destabilizes, expanding into a colossal, diffuse, and ambiguous shadow that slowly dissolves into the architectural recesses of the room. When the ultimate crimson ember at the apex of the wick releases a final, microscopic thread of incense-laden smoke and surrenders to the atmospheric pressure, the interior of the scriptorium is instantly inundated by an absolute, structurally impenetrable darkness, the eternal, authoritative stasis of the imperial spring night. As your visual cortex completely adapts to this absolute absence of photons, you begin to detect a new acoustic frequency descending from the celestial altitudes of Mount Hiei, located kilometers away across the valley. It is the rhythmic, subterranean vocalization of the Tendai monks executing their midnight liturgical chants, reverberating down from the monumental temple complexes. This auditory phenomenon does not consist of fragmented, individual syllables. Rather, it operates as a singular, monolithic vibration, a universal acoustic spine, ricocheting off the geological fault lines, the trunks of ancient cedars, and the heavy atmospheric moisture suspended over the Kyoto basin. The monks' heavily grounded, guttural intonations, flawlessly synchronized with the biological mechanics of human respiration and utterly devoid of acceleration, interweave with the relentless, static hum of the crickets, effectively sealing the entire urban grid within a colossal acoustic chrysalis. While you remain stationed within the unyielding wooden skeleton of this summer pavilion, anchored by the protective, gravitational mass of 12 layers of silk, you have attained the absolute, immutable point of temporal and informational stasis. The exhaustive architectural calculations, the centuries-old metallurgical chemistry of the ink, and the mathematical philosophy of the blank parchment that previously occupied your cognition have been entirely supplanted by the slow, deliberate rhythm of respiration, merging flawlessly with the self-isolating, magnificent permanence of this millennial sanctuary. When Murasaki Shikibu deliberately rendered that terminal manuscript page an absolute physical void, it was not the consequence of narrative exhaustion. Conversely, she operated under the profound epistemological certainty that monolithic silence constitutes the most structurally flawless, unassailable syntax ever formulated within the human intellect. At this exact temporal and spatial juncture, you too inhabit the precise coordinates of that immaculate emptiness. The carbon-based chemistry of the ink has irreversibly oxidized into permanence. The Paulownia wood archive has definitively engaged its hermetic seal, and the thermal energy of the illuminating flame has been entirely eradicated. This millennial stillness, the profound gravitational mass of the historic parchment,
and the rain-purified eternal permanence of the imperial architecture are now fully entrusted to the deep, unconscious stasis of your own mind. Farewell to the waking realm, sagacious intellects. Have you ever considered the arduous, often unforgiving physical toll exacted upon both nature and human endurance, merely to preserve a single word, a solitary letter, or an ancient philosophical paradigm across the centuries? You are now entirely removed from the relentless, superficial, and exhausting chaos of the modern day. While many environments demand a forceful emptying of the cognitive faculties, true intellectual tranquility is achieved when the mind gradually decelerates of its own accord, anchored by the profound and venerable weight of historical data. In this installment of Uncharted history, we embark upon a trajectory far beyond the realm of ordinary fables or synthetic acoustics, entering instead the hypnotic and dignified cadence of a strictly academic exposition. Tonight, you shall bear witness, at a microscopic level, to the genesis of a monolithic artifact, a codex, whose pages are derived not from timber, but from earth and flesh, whose ink was meticulously distilled from soot and iron gall, and whose every structural binding was threaded within the freezing, absolute silence of the Dark Ages. We will descend into the obscured monasteries of late antiquity, examining the collapse of the papyrus supply chain and the unprecedented biological and chemical transformation of rawhide, exploring how a book is not merely a vessel for reading, but a monumental work of structural engineering in its most intricate detail. As your intellect becomes saturated with the caustic chemistry of lime vats, the precise geometry of reed pen calamus angles, and the sheer gravitational mass of solid oak bindings, this arduous construction of knowledge will pull you into the immutable stagnation of history itself. There is absolutely no need to accelerate our pace. Time has long since crystallized within these texts. Simply fixate your attention upon the profound depth of the narrative and the ancient, tactile texture residing beneath the ink. Now, leaving all acoustic pollution of the exterior world far behind, you take your first, most imperceptible step toward the threshold of the manuscript archives, situated deep beneath Heidelberg University, a dimly lit, thermally regulated sanctuary maintained in absolute, hermetic isolation. Far beneath the colossal neo-Renaissance stone edifices of Heidelberg University, you are slowly navigating toward the subterranean vaults, a realm where sunlight has not penetrated for decades, governed by an absolute, unbroken silence. Each step you descend is carved from the cold grey limestone of Central Europe. The dense, rhythmic reverberation of your footfalls echoes heavily through the high vaulted marble corridors, gradually dissipating into the stone before the next step lands. As you journey deeper into this geological stratum, where information assumes a tangible physical mass, the very texture of the ambient air pressing against you begins to shift. You have entered a strictly regulated atmospheric zone, continuously monitored by thermodynamic sensors that lock the ambient temperature precisely at 18 degrees Celsius. This sterile, dignified, and immutable chill is the product of meticulous climate engineering, permanently freezing the relative humidity at exactly 45% to flawlessly preserve the cellular integrity of the dormant organic materials housed within. At the terminus of the corridor, you arrive before a massive 19th century cast iron door. Accompanied only by the distant, echoing and monotonous ticking of an antique mechanical clock, you insert a heavy brass key into the lock. The dense, metallic friction generated within the locking mechanism serves as the acoustic preamble to a centuries-old ritual. Pushing the door open with an agonizing slowness, crossing the threshold amidst the frictionless silence of heavy iron hinges, you are immediately met with the atmospheric essence of crystallized time. This is not the generic scent of antiquity. It is the highly specific, slightly sweet, vanilla-like aroma born from the microscopic photochemical degradation of cellulose and lignin residing within the organic fibers of the parchment. This olfactory signature is accompanied by the heavy, resinous scent of floor-to-ceiling solid oak shelving, the ancient texture left by centuries of particulate matter suspended in the air, and the profound, old-world gravity radiating from countless leather bindings. You step inside, and the heavy iron door seals behind you with a muffled finality, entirely severing you from the acoustic pollution, the haste, and the chaos of the exterior world. You are now stationed at the epicenter of a completely isolated chrysalis of data, a manuscript archive. Proceeding across the stone flooring of the dimly lit library, your gaze naturally converges upon the dead center of the chamber. There, resting upon a colossal walnut desk, its dark, heavily veined wood rendered flawlessly smooth by centuries of tactile contact, sits a brass-bodied banker's lamp, crowned with an emerald green glass shade. The low-lumen amber illumination cast by this bulb leaves the vast majority of the room submerged in a sea of dense shadows, choosing only to spotlight a narrow circumference at the center of the desk with the uncompromising severity of a theatrical stage. As your fingertips trace the carved edge of the walnut timber, you gravitate toward the artifact positioned squarely in the center of the light. Resting upon a bed of acid-free museum velvet, it sits with an exhausted yet deeply majestic presence, a monumental codex. The velocity of the outside world completely loses its jurisdiction behind these walls. Here, chronology is not measured in seconds or minutes, but by the duration it takes for a single dust mote to drift through that amber shaft of light. This massive tome, currently situated just millimeters from your hands, is far more than a bound volume. It is an epistemological time capsule that has remained virtually unopened for 1400 years, its exposure to oxygen kept to an absolute minimum, harboring the deep obscurity of late antiquity within its core. The highly specific structural knot anchoring its binding carries the final, physical trace of a singular monastery, an extinct tradition of Coptic bookbinding forever lost to the fringes of the Dark Ages. Tonight, we shall not physically untangle this knot. Rather, we will meticulously deconstruct the architectural reasoning behind its existence, the millennial silence woven into the very textile of its silk, and the mechanical, repetitive cadence once commanded by the hands of its master craftsmen. Welcome. This environment is immutable, it is profoundly ancient, and it stands as a monument to absolute cognitive stillness. Seated at the head of the desk, enveloped by the highly restricted, dignified amber illumination filtering through the emerald green glass of the banker's lamp, you are surrounded by an absolute, monumental silence. From somewhere deep within the labyrinthine corridors of the library, the heavy, rhythmic ticking of a mechanical clock reverberates against the marble walls, projecting a distant acoustic pulse. This singular sound fundamentally alters the spatial perception of time, severing it from mundane haste and anchoring it to the sluggish, majestic procession of centuries. The monolithic codex resting before you upon the acid-free museum velvet is positioned there not merely for perusal, but to command a profound preference without the necessity of tactile interference. The rigorous ethics of archival preservation demand an unyielding state of physical isolation when approaching organic materials of this caliber. To ensure that the natural oils, perspiration, and inherent acidity of your fingertips do not trigger irreversible photochemical degradation across this 1400-year-old surface, your hands are sheathed in impeccably thin, white gloves woven from pure cotton. To protect an artifact is not simply to entomb it behind a locked door. It is the highly calculated, scientific discipline of decelerating its existential rate of decay at a fundamental, molecular level.
As your gaze travels across the thick, leather-bound exterior of the codex, boards that have undergone slight geological deformations over the millennia, your cognitive focus is inexorably drawn toward the opaque and indeterminate atmosphere of late antiquity. During that protracted and agonizing epoch stretching between the 4th and 7th centuries, the preservation of knowledge constituted a brutally physical struggle, far heavier and more tangible than the modern intellect can readily comprehend. Information was not a weightless cluster of data drifting through digital clouds. It was entirely organic, harvested from the earth and the water, and consequently, it was inherently vulnerable to all the destructive forces of nature, a material permanently condemned to decomposition. In those obscured centuries, to keep a text alive meant engaging in continuous warfare against atmospheric moisture, airborne fungal spores, the voracious appetite of silverfish, Lepisma saccharinum, that relentlessly consumed cellulose and starch-based adhesives, and above all, the unforgiving oxidative power of time itself. Staring at this robust and overwhelmingly heavy codex currently occupying the desk, you reflect upon its predecessor, the legendary substrate that once circulated through the intellectual arteries of the ancient world, papyrus. The entirety of the jurisprudential texts, philosophical dialogues, and literary epics of the Greco-Roman civilizations were entrusted to a single aquatic plant, Cyperus papyrus, cultivated within the sweltering, muddy marshlands and alluvial banks of the Nile River. The manufacturing of this botanical substrate was an extraordinarily refined craft, strictly dictated by its geographical parameters. The triangular stems of these reeds, which reached heights of up to 3 meters in the waters of the Nile, were severed and stripped of their rigid, green outer rind. The white, spongy pith contained within was then sliced into paper-thin ribbons known as filuri, using specialized blades. These damp, fragile strips were systematically arranged upon wooden workstations, first aligned on a vertical axis, then overlaid horizontally at precise right angles, before being subjected to a rhythmic, mechanical beating with wooden mallets for hours on end. During this relentless, concussive process, the cellular walls of the plant were ruptured, releasing a natural polymeric sap that miraculously bonded the fibers into a cohesive sheet. Subsequently dried under the relentless Egyptian sun and burnished with pumice stone, these sheets formed the plagulae, the universal vessels of information for the ancient world. However, papyrus harbored a monumental structural disadvantage. While it could maintain its physical integrity for millennia within the arid, desiccated sands of Egypt and the dry climate of the Mediterranean basin, once transported to the freezing, damp and dimly lit monasteries of the European north, it functioned much like a sponge, absorbing atmospheric humidity, swelling, delaminating into its constituent fibers, and rapidly succumbing to rot. Furthermore, due to its brittle botanical architecture, it was entirely intolerant of being folded. If one attempted to fold a sheet of papyrus in half, the diagonally interlaced fibers would instantly shatter with a sharp, catastrophic snap, severing the text completely. Consequently, papyrus sheets were forcibly glued end to end and rolled into extensive, continuous cylinders known as volumina. This immensely laborious format, requiring the simultaneous use of both hands to unravel one end while tightly coiling the other, was fundamentally impractical for rigorous academic cross-referencing and rapid textual navigation. Observing the subtle, undulating curvature of the leather pages illuminated by the amber light upon your desk, you recall the precise historical mechanics that precipitated the downfall of the papyrus monopoly. By the dawn of the 7th century, the geopolitical fault lines across the Mediterranean basin had begun to fracture with a deafening resonance. The expansion of Islamic armies across Egypt and North Africa fundamentally severed the maritime supply chains, permanently halting the voyages of the massive wooden cargo vessels, naves honorariae, that once departed from the port of Alexandria, heavily laden with colossal bales of papyrus destined for the harbour of Ostia or the docks of Constantinople.
The Mediterranean Sea ceased to function as a secure, navigable conduit unifying the ancient world. It transformed, instead, into an impenetrable geopolitical barrier, demarcating the boundary between two entirely distinct civilizations.
The monasteries of continental Europe, the isolated scriptoria nestled within the fog-shrouded hills of Ireland, and the scribal workshops of the Frankish kingdoms were suddenly plunged into an unprecedented logistical crisis. They were bound by the ecclesiastical necessity to produce new theological manuscripts, to replenish deteriorating copies of scripture, and to transcribe the fading legacy of the ancient world for future generations. Yet, they possessed absolutely no substrate upon which to record this data. Egypt's botanical monopoly had been irrevocably shattered, and the foundation upon which knowledge rested was utterly depleted. At the very apex of this intellectual desperation, a monumental alternative presented itself, grazing just beyond the monastery walls. The vast herds of sheep, goats, and calves, biologically adapted to the freezing climates of the north. The demand for a new, resilient, and foldable carrier of information necessitated a brutal, sanguinary transition from the botanical kingdom to the animal kingdom. The fragile, plant-based anatomy of papyrus was about to be replaced by a radically different formula, one that required flesh and blood to undergo agonizingly slow chemical and mechanical processes to be converted into writing material, parchment. And the massive leaves of the codex resting before you right now stand as the silent yet most profound physical testament to that colossal transformation. Under the restricted, dignified amber illumination of the banker's lamp, your gloved fingers gently grasp one of the initial pages of the codex, turning the heavy leaf with an unparalleled, deliberate slowness. The deep, slightly rigid and textile-like rustle the page produces as it displaces the surrounding air exists far beyond the acoustic parameters of ordinary paper. It is the whispering friction of a profound, organic resistance. This cold, frictionless, ivory-hued surface resting against your fingertips is no mundane parchment. It is the absolute pinnacle of luxury and inaccessibility from the scriptoria of late antiquity and the Middle Ages, a substrate formerly classified as vitelline or calfskin vellum. Compared to the more common, coarser sheep or goat hides, vitelline represents the zenith of the biochemical craft. It is a matrix where follicular traces or microscopic hair roots are virtually imperceptible, where vascular pathways have been systematically obliterated, and which possesses a bone-like porcelain whiteness that seems to actively absorb and trap the ambient light. Yet, this frictionless perfection is not a spontaneous blessing bestowed by nature. It is the direct consequence of a grueling, weeks-long continuum of chemical and physical torment, representing the mechanical reconstruction of a biological architecture. Within your mind, the primordial state of this page, once a living, breathing entity, begins to materialize, initiating a strictly academic expedition into the damp, humid, and heavily aromatic tanneries situated on the periphery of the monastery grounds. The quasi-metallurgical conversion of a raw hide into parchment commences with the continuous submersion of the skin within a massive wooden vats, perpetually flushed by the freezing river currents running adjacent to the monastery walls. The purging of blood, soil, and residual organic matter constitutes a monotonous, multi-day cycle of rudimentary cleansing. However, the primary cellular transmutation is catalyzed only when the hides are plunged into the depths of the lime vats. Formulated with slaked lime or calcium hydroxide, hauled directly from deep limestone quarries, this highly alkaline solution initiates a silent, unrelenting chemical warfare against the epidermal tissue and hair follicles of the skin. The hides are suspended within these caustic, corrosive pools for a duration spanning 8 to 14 days, subjected to regular, daily agitation via heavy wooden poles. The calcium hydroxide systematically dissolves the keratin cells situated within the uppermost dermal layer, loosens the follicular structures, and hydrolyzes the underlying adipose tissue through a rigorous process of saponification. The paramount function of this chemical immersion is to induce the severe swelling of the internal collagen network, forcing the biological matrix to absorb vast quantities of water until it assumes a highly elastic, sponge-like geometry. Extracted from this alkaline inferno, the hide has now devolved into an amorphous, frictionless, exceedingly heavy, grey-white gelatinous mass. Following multiple successive washings to thoroughly purge the residual lime, this dense mass is subsequently draped over a convex wooden scraping block, known formally in the craft as a beam. Firmly gripping a specifically blunted, convex blade with both hands, the artisan begins to systematically shear both surfaces of the skin, employing heavy, rhythmic, and brutal mechanical downward strokes. The final remnants of adipose and muscular tissue residing within the hypodermis on the flesh side, alongside the loosened biological matter on the grain side, are meticulously eradicated through this monotonous application of blunt physical force. Nevertheless, at this highly specific juncture, the material is not yet parchment. It is merely a sanitized, raw biological membrane. The miraculous mechanism that formally elevates the hide into parchment, transitioning it from the status of mere skin into an eternal vessel for epistemological data, is the unforgiving, bidirectional physical tension applied during the desiccation phase. Unlike the traditional tanning process, these hides are not chemically stabilized or preserved utilizing tannic acids. Rather, they are dried through the application of absolute physical violence and extreme stretching. Visualize the artisan mounting this saturated, heavy membrane onto a colossal stretching frame, either rectangular or circular in geometry, constructed from solid oak timber, known as a hearse. Small, smooth, spherical river stones, referred to as pippins, are strategically enveloped within the perimeter of the hide, which is then folded over itself and securely knotted with heavy hemp cords. The opposing ends of these rigid cords are subsequently anchored to rotating wooden pegs embedded along the outer edge of the frame. As the artisan rotates these pegs millimeter by precise millimeter, the cords become brutally taut, suspending the hide in the dead center of the timber frame under equal, omnidirectional force, identical to the highly calibrated acoustical tension of a drum head. It is at this exact spatial coordinate that the hypnotic, rhythmic physical intervention commences. Held firmly within the artisan's grasp rests the most iconic, elegant, yet inherently dangerous metallurgical instrument of parchment making, the lunellum, a crescent-shaped steel blade. The semicircular curvature of this steel tool exists for a critical engineering purpose. Engaging a hide under such extreme tensile stress with a straight, sharp-pointed blade carries the catastrophic risk of instantaneously rupturing the membrane, destroying weeks of labor in a fraction of a second. The flawlessly curved surface of the lunellum glides seamlessly across the taut topography of the skin. Within the dim, absolute silence of the library, your auditory cortex registers that precise acoustic phenomenon, the remarkably faint, dry, papery, and perfectly rhythmic friction generated when the steel edge of the lunellum is dragged across the damp, tensioned hide at a highly specific geometric angle. Shh. As the blade descends in sweeping, arcing motions from top to bottom, the excess interstitial water, alongside the absolute final microscopic particulates of connective tissue, are scraped away in a translucent, uniform layer. The artisan calibrates the angle of the blade and the applied downward pressure with such flawless precision that the total thickness of the hide becomes perfectly uniform across every square millimeter of its surface area. As the skin desiccates while under this extreme mechanical tension, the water molecules evaporate, prompting the biological material to instinctively contract and shrink upon itself. However, the merciless tensile force exerted by the rotating wooden pegs absolutely forbids this retraction. The violent collision of these opposing forces permanently alters the microscopic anatomy of the dermis. The internal collagen fibers, which naturally possess a three-dimensional, chaotic, and irregular network structure, are completely and forcefully aligned under this tremendous load, reconfiguring into a strictly parallel, two-dimensional, and exceptionally dense structural matrix. The underlying secret to the rigid, inflexible, and monumental durability of parchment, the very structural phenomenon responsible for that deep, textile-like rustle as you turn the pages, is embedded entirely within this mechanical realignment of the collagen fibers. In the final phase, mere moments before the material is liberated from the oak frame, the pouncing process is initiated. An abrasive technique engineered to ensure the surface absorbs ink with flawless capillary action and acquires a velvety, matte texture. Fine porosity pumice stones of volcanic origin are rubbed across the surface in exceedingly gentle, circular motions, microscopically abrading the glossy, frictionless exterior layer. Subsequently, an ultrafine chalk powder rich in calcium carbonate, or alternatively, calcined bone ash, is meticulously worked into the grain to absorb any residual cellular lipid molecules and permanently secure that bone-like, opaque whiteness. This highly specific powder effectively packs the open dermal pores, creating a mineral barrier that permanently prevents the future iron gall ink from dispersing laterally, mechanically neutralizing the phenomenon known as ink bleeding. At this juncture, the organic, decomposing hide has effectively perished. In its place, the smooth, cold, and eternal substrate known as pergamena has been born, a matrix engineered to defy the destructive oxidation of time and harbor epistemology within the darkness of a scriptorium for millennia. That exact surface currently rests beneath your fingertips, existing in a state of dignified, absolute stillness, serving as a silent monument to the unyielding mechanical tension it once endured. As the amber beam of light filtering through the emerald green glass of the banker's lamp refracts at a horizontal angle across the burnished vitelline page, you focus your attention upon the heavy, dark, and sharply defined letters inscribed onto the bone-white parchment. Each individual character stands as a geometric monument, having broken away from the dark, mute atmosphere of 1400 years ago, successfully resisting the destructive flow of time to meet your gaze within this subterranean vault. As your eyes trace the flawless, mathematically precise spacing between the words, the millimeter-perfect parallelism of the lines, and the structural distribution of the ink upon the surface, your mind gradually drifts away from the physical confines of this archive, descending smoothly toward the deeply profound, frigid, and absolutely silent monastic chambers of late antiquity, into the depths of the scriptorium. The scriptorium, functioning as the cognitive epicenter of the monastery, is architecturally designed as a colossal stone masonry hall, completely isolated from the exterior world and the mundane daily operations of the monastic complex, deliberately oriented toward the north to capture daylight in its most stable, shadowless manifestation. Crucially, there is no hearth within this space to provide warmth. The introduction of fire would generate soot, ash, and microscopic carbon particulates that could inflict irreversible, catastrophic damage upon the still wet ink and the meticulously sanitized parchment. Consequently, the interior remains perpetually damp, enveloped by the deeply penetrating chill radiating from the massive stone walls. The absolute draconian law governing the scriptorium is the rule of silentium, an unbroken, immutable silence. Throughout the grueling, hours-long continuum of mental and physical labor, the copyists communicate with one another exclusively through a complex lexicon of ancient hand signals. The singular acoustic reality within this environment consists merely of deep inhalations dissipating against the high, vaulted stone ceilings, the faint, structural groans of wooden reading stands, and the dry, dense, rhythmic scratching of the quill descending upon the parchment. Within this freezing stone chamber constructed in your mind, you observe a copyist
seated at a wooden desk inclined at a severe 45-degree angle. This highly specific geometric inclination is deliberately engineered to ensure that the ink flows from the nib of the pen onto the parchment at an optimal viscosity, aided by the force of gravity, while simultaneously maintaining the source text at the precise optical elevation of the scribe. Grasped firmly within the copyist's left hand is a small, exceptionally sharp steel blade known as the scalprum. The function of this blade extends far beyond merely scraping away a flawed character before the ink oxidizes. It is simultaneously deployed to pin and stabilize the organic, highly elastic parchment during the act of transcription. The scribe must never touch the page directly, as the natural lipid molecules present on human skin, upon contacting that meticulously prepared calcium carbonate surface, would deposit a microscopic barrier, permanently repelling the ink and ruining the integrity of the manuscript forever. Held within the right hand rests one of the most profound engineering marvels in the history of epistemology, the pen, formerly classified as the calamus or penna. While this instrument might occasionally be crafted from a reed harvested from the freezing wetlands of the north, it is far more frequently a primary flight feather extracted from the left wing of a goose. The biological architecture of a left wing feather possesses a natural curvature that aligns flawlessly with the anatomical and ergonomic requirements of a right-handed scribe's writing angle. The shaft of the feather, the calamus, is initially baked slowly within hot sand baths to completely eradicate the internal marrow and structurally harden the keratin matrix. Following this thermal treatment, the scribe utilizes the small steel blade to carve 3 critical incisions into the tip. The precise angle of these cuts dictates the structural anatomy of the resulting typographic character, whether it be the rounded geometries of the uncial script or the more angular dimensions of the Carolingian minuscule. The microscopic central fissure, or cleft, carved straight down the middle of the nib, serves as an absolute masterpiece of applied physics, specifically exploiting the dynamics of capillary action. When the pen is submerged into the ink, the fluid remains suspended within this narrow channel via surface tension, and at the exact millisecond the keratin tip contacts the parchment, it initiates a controlled, uninterrupted downward flow. Yet the true chemical miracle occurring within this chamber lies concealed within the fluid dripping from the tip of that pen, the iron gall ink. When you examine the small hollowed horn inkwell, cornu, resting upon the desk, you perceive a dense, heavy, and obscured liquid waiting within. This compound deviates entirely from the standard carbon-based soot inks of antiquity. Its genesis relies upon a bizarre, highly specific biological interaction between a tree and an insect. A microscopic wasp, belonging to the Cynipidae family, deposits its eggs directly into the tender, nascent shoots of the oak tree, Quercus infectoria. In response to this parasitic invasion, the botanical defense mechanism of the tree forms a hard, spherical tumor known as a gall around the egg, a structure containing astronomically high concentrations of tannic acid. Scribes harvest these oak galls, pulverize them into a fine dust using heavy mortars, and steep the particulate matter for days in rainwater, vinegar, or white wine, successfully extracting that astringent, yellowish tannic acid solution. This yellowish fluid, however, does not yet constitute ink. To acquire its profound color and indelible character, crystalline ferrous sulfate, historically extracted from ancient mining deposits and known as vitriol, is introduced into the solution. The precise moment the iron interacts with the tannic acid, a monumental chemical reaction is triggered, forming a complex molecule known as ferrogallotannate. Nevertheless, this liquid initially remains a pale, anemic gray. It only achieves its dark, midnight black hue through a slow, deliberate process of oxidation, gradually darkening over the span of several hours only after it has been applied to the parchment and exposed to atmospheric oxygen.
To perfectly calibrate the fluidic density or viscosity and to prevent the heavy iron particulates from settling at the bottom of the horn, gum arabic is integrated into the mixture. Occasionally, to achieve a slightly glossy, enamel-like texture on the surface and to facilitate the ink's penetration into the microscopic pores of the parchment before desiccation, a small quantity of natural honey and a chemical binder, such as alum, are added to the formula. When you closely scrutinize the dark brown nuances upon the page beneath the light of the lamp, you realize that the iron gall ink does not merely rest superficially upon the paper. Rather, it physically integrates with the biological texture of the parchment. The inherent high acidity of the ferrous sulfate has, through a painfully slow and relentless chemical reaction spanning centuries, slightly burned into the collagen-based architecture of the vitelline, creating microscopic, crater-like depressions exactly where the letters reside. This localized chemical combustion imbues the text not only with visual weight, but with a three-dimensional sculptural depth. The rust-colored, heavy brown and deep black oxidation tones pooling within the sharp corners of the letters serve as the cartographic evidence of time's slow, silent march across the surface of the page. Within the freezing, dimly lit, absolute silence of the scriptorium, each individual movement of the pen manifests as the dignified step of an ancient ritual. Every time the keratin tip makes contact with that taut, calcium-glazed organic surface, carving the curvature of a letter, that dry, dense and hypnotic friction echoes across the stone walls of the chamber. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The rhythmic sequence of the copyist submerging the pen into the horn, wiping away the excess and returning to the parchment. The transcription of every single word stands as a cognitive meditation, an act of absolute physical devotion. When the page is entirely saturated with text, and the characters begin their slow oxidation from that faint grey toward the deepest shade of black, the scribe turns that heavy, thick page by its very edge with an unparalleled slowness. The deep, heavy, low-frequency hum generated as the page cuts through the air momentarily disrupts the silence of the room, only to be immediately replaced once more by the mechanical, monotonous rhythm of the transcription. As your eyes glide over those flawlessly aligned rows of text, the dignified, laborious construction of these letters forcefully decelerates your mind. The physical and arduous genesis of this knowledge pulling you deep into its own immutable stagnation. As the amber beam of illumination filtering through the emerald glass of the banker's lamp makes its final, deliberate pass across the heavily oxidized parchment, you perceive the physical culmination of the scriptorium's exhaustive labor. Beyond the absolute silence of the archive, penetrating the massive subterranean marble walls, you can faintly discern the distant, muffled resonance of a heavy, rhythmic night rain. This deep, water-borne acoustic vibration is accompanied by the continuous, low-frequency hum of the library's climate control system, resonating through the floorboards like the steady respiration of a dormant geological giant. Your gaze focuses upon the monumental block of information resting at the center of the desk, observing the exact structural mechanisms through which hundreds of isolated leaves were engineered into a singular, colossal entity. When the monotonous transcription process finally concluded, the individual parchment folios were meticulously assembled and folded into nested fascicles, formerly classified in codicology as quires or gatherings. Each quire typically consists of 4 folded bifolios, yielding a total of 16 pages. This precise geometric sequencing serves as the fundamental cellular architecture governing the structural integrity of the entire codex. As your gloved fingers glide slowly down the thick, slightly convex spine of the book, you palpate the invisible architecture, the hidden anatomy of the bindings that has maintained strict cohesion across the centuries. The defining characteristic of the Coptic binding tradition and the subsequent antique sewing techniques that evolved from it lies in the heavy, tendon-like ridges concealed beneath the leather along the spinal column.
When the master binder, ligator, positioned the quires upon a heavy wooden sewing frame, he pierced millimeter-precise perforations through the central fold of each fascicle, utilizing a sharpened bone awl. The thread employed for this task was not a mundane cotton or wool. It was a heavy, robust twine spun from the most resilient fibers of the raw flax plant, systematically drawn through pure beeswax multiple times to completely eradicate friction and inherently repel biological decay. In your mind's eye, you register the dull, resistant, and heavy acoustic signature generated as the binder's crude iron needle forcefully penetrated the overlapping layers of parchment. The mechanical friction created as the wax-coated linen thread was pulled through those narrow, calcium-glazed perforations left a dry, rhythmic hush, hush, suspended in the air with every deliberate stroke. This methodical sewing process wove complex, structural knots around thick leather or hempen cords positioned on the horizontal axis, effectively compressing the disparate quires into a monolithic core known as the text block. Yet this dense body of parchment had not quite achieved its eternal, immutable form. Your fingertips trace the exterior boards of the codex, structures possessing an astronomical physical density. Vastly removed from the fragile cardboard-reinforced covers of the modern era, these boards are massive, solid blocks of timber harvested directly from the heart of the forest, carved from the trunks of centuries-old oak, Quercus robur, or beech trees. The botanical selection and the subsequent milling of this timber were never arbitrary. The log was not cut horizontally, but rather sawn on a radial axis from the center outward, a highly specialized woodworking technique known as quarter sawing. This precise geometric cut operates as a millimeter-perfect engineering countermeasure, permanently preventing the wood from warping, bending, or fracturing under the inevitable fluctuations of atmospheric humidity across the millennia. Why, one might ask, does a book require such a monumentally heavy and massive wooden enclosure? The answer lies concealed within the feral, organic nature of the parchment resting inside. Parchment is a fiercely hygroscopic material. At the slightest deviation in ambient humidity, the internal collagen fibers desperately attempt to revert to their original biological configuration, violently seeking to curl, warp, and buckle. The overwhelming physical mass of these solid oak boards is engineered specifically to suppress this biological rebellion, functioning as a colossal, perpetual press that traps hundreds of pages in a state of eternal, absolute flatness. In the final stage of its genesis, the exterior of the wooden boards was wrapped in alum-tawed pigskin or fine calfskin, treated extensively with natural tannins. While still damp, the leather was stretched over the timber and meticulously smoothed with bone folders to achieve flawless adhesion over the edges. Subsequently, brass or iron stamps, heated by metallurgists, were pressed into the surface under extreme mechanical load, a technique known as blind tooling, forging deep, geometric, and silent motifs permanently into the hide. As your fingers navigate the topography of the cover, you encounter the protruding brass hardware situated at the corners, formerly designated as bosses. These metallic fixtures are strictly functional rather than decorative. They act as mechanical elevations, preventing the leather surface from suffering frictional abrasion when the heavy codex is placed upon a stone desk or a wooden reading lectern. And reaching from the foredge to anchor into the back cover are the heavy, formidable brass clasps. To close a codex is not merely to obscure its pages. It is the definitive act of engaging the leather straps, locking the mechanisms into their respective housings, and sealing the book completely against the exterior world, against oxygen and against light, culminating in that resonant, absolute click. The completion of the book as a physical artifact simultaneously dictates its solemn spatial relationship with its environment. Within the depths of antiquity and the Middle Ages, books were never arranged vertically, side by side upon shelves, as is the custom in contemporary libraries. Subjecting such an astronomically heavy wooden binding and a massive block of parchment to a vertical orientation would invite the relentless gravitational pull to tear the pages from the spine, loosen the bindings, and ultimately collapse the structural integrity of the codex entirely. Consequently, these volumes were laid completely flat upon their broad surfaces within massive wooden chests known as armaria, or upon deep horizontal shelving units. This represents a literal physical recumbency, an eternal resting state where epistemology makes its absolute peace with gravity. Now, within the dim isolation of this subterranean vault, immersed in the dignified aroma of aged oak and cured leather, the colossal and mute anatomy of the book rests peacefully upon the desk, its heavy brass clasps having long since been engaged. All those agonizing organic processes, the caustic lime vats, the brutally tensioned hides, the slowly oxidizing inks, and the rhythmic strikes of the needle have consolidated into a single monolithic object, achieving a state of unbreakable stasis. As the distant acoustic resonance of the night rain dissipates into a monotonous whisper behind the marble walls, the low-frequency hum of the climate control systematically envelops the chamber. And thus, the final page closes with a profound, heavy silence. The ink has desiccated, the leather has cooled to ambient temperature, and the data has returned to the dark, secure shelf where it permanently belongs. There are no further historical events to recount, no further chronologies to decipher. There remains only the profound stillness of this room and the immutable gravitational mass of the text. We extinguish the lamp. The archive shall remain in a state of suspended animation, perpetually preserving its quietude.